Hello everyone, today I'll take a look at one of what could be considered the worst tribes in Polytopia, and we'll try and figure out a strategy that makes them at least somewhat usable. Now after this introduction, I tend to launch into an analysis of exactly why the specific tribe I'm talking about is good or bad, and describe that tribe's specific quirks and aspects. In the case of Vengir though, this tribe is fairly simple to describe and has a single even simpler problem. So then, Vengir is Polytopia's aggressive tribe. They start off in a wasteland with severely reduced animal and fruit spawn rates. Their starting tech is the smithery tech, which allows for the immediate construction of a powerful swordsman unit, which is also their starting unit. The tech also allows the construction of forges, which provide population for nearby cities if placed next to mines. That's it, apart from a few minor stats like adjusted farm and mine spawn rates. So what makes Vengir a bad tribe? You might not see the problems straight away, but it's simply this: Vengir are designed the wrong way round. What I mean by this is that the optimal strategy in Polytopia is usually to build a strong economy early on and then conquer enemies with strong units in the mid to late game. For this reason, tribes that can upgrade their capital on turn 0 are always the top picks, at least before Cementi existed, which is its own topic. This demands a little explaining, but the expansionist player who does not tend to their economy faces a whole host of different downsides. Rising tech prices limit access to stronger units, the lack of star boost makes funding invasions difficult, and a large undefended empire is liable to getting invaded quickly. For that reason, Vengir are the wrong way around from a game design perspective. They take too long to start their economy, in the absence of fruit in game early on, and early expansions are almost always ineffective. Of course, on crowded maps, the Vengir double swordsman attack I demonstrate in this video is as effective as any. But this series operates under the implicit assumption of a fairly normal Polytopia setup, meaning the water and geographical distance are both serious factors in limiting Vengir's ability to expand. However, that's not to say that Vengir are by any means useless. The most important thing with Vengir is to get the early game right, thereby setting yourself up for success later on. In this regard, my suggestion for the early game is to take a look at your surroundings and ask yourself a few simple questions. Firstly, are you surrounded by water? In this case, no option except for fishing should be considered, as you'll need to develop overseas. Vengir is needless to say not set up for this, but you may have to play from such a position by bad luck. Secondly, are you next to another tribe? If the answer is yes, then the best option is the second swordsman to immediately attack them and wipe them out. There are no exceptions to this other than perhaps Quetzali for their defenders. Thirdly, if you do have a good deal of forest in your territory, then you should do well to build a warrior on turn 0 and save up stars up until the 4th or 5th turn, at which point you will need to research riding and then free spirit. This will allow you to chop down any trees in villages near to you for an economic boost that can fund researching economic tech. If none of these conditions are met whatsoever, then your next best option is to resort to the use of an economic tech. I suggest organisation, as it is a tech that leads to farming, which will be of use to you in the middle game. Speaking of the middle game, Vengir's excellent spawn rate for farms and metal means that you'll be able to develop well once you have survived the opening. You can of course invest in sailing to build boats and ships as well, and will also be just one step away from knights in some opening variations, which can also be a good unit to use. This is probably about as close as a foolproof checklist for a Vengir opening as you're likely to get from me, but it still doesn't mean guaranteed success. Vengir players often feel tempted to overextend even later on in the game in order to make up for their lack of early targets, but I always advise caution when attacking while economically behind the enemy. Do not think that swordsmen mean you have the advantage in every fight, and past about turn 5 you could realistically have little to no advantage at all against a strong player. It is always a good idea to evaluate factors such as score and number of cities before deciding whether to attack an opponent as any tribe, but it's worth repeating here. Now let's discuss the final aspect of the way in which you should go about playing Vengir, which is matchups against other tribes. Vengir tend to suffer against tribes that can level up their capital straight away, simply because Vengir are unable to maintain their advantage for long, and tribes like Imperius can afford a quick level 3 city that will be difficult even for swordsmen to attack. So it is almost never recommended to attack these tribes outside of the first few turns, even when you are ahead in score. Being the only tribe that starts the game with a level 3 tech, Vengir often starts off ahead in score, but once again this is not an invitation to immediately start banging your head against the door of your opponent's capital. Illyrian are worth mentioning separately because they are the other expansionist tribe in Polytopia. You may be aware that I have a separate guide on the topic of Illyrian on my channel, but suffice it to say that Vengir are much more committed to being aggressive than Illyrian due to having a far worse early game economy. and as such, if you can attack Illyrion in the first few turns, it is worth doing. Make sure you land the first blow though, as a full health Polysaur has significant first strike damage that may hinder your plans of attack. Aside from the aforementioned T0 tribes, Quetzali and possibly mountain tribes who hide behind their terrain such as Jinji and Aimo, then Vengir is a tribe that is well placed to compete in crowded games and can generally hold its own most of the time. I don't really think there's anything wrong with Vengir per se, they have a niche and occupy it well. Unfortunately, the tribe is unlikely to be viable under its current setup, barring a drastic shift in the map. And the final aspect of Vengir which I wanted to discuss is the late game strategy. Once as Vengir you've developed into the late game, you may of course want to replace your swordsmen with more hardy endgame units. For this purpose I would recommend using a navy composed mostly of defenders or giants inside of battleships, because these have the highest cost to hit points ratio. I discussed this in my basics video, but essentially what you're doing here is you're getting the most value out of the stars, because the ships have a separate attack stat that's not at all determined by the attack stat of the unit you put in the ship. So for example, a catapult costs 8 stars but only has 10 health, so it's useless to put in a ship because the catapult simply doesn't have enough health to last very long, but its attack stat is overridden by the attack stat of the boat. Therefore, what you want is units that don't necessarily have a high attack stat, but do have a high defense stat or a high hit point stat. As for your land army, swordsmen can be sufficient, however, you do also want to potentially get knights, as I believe I mentioned earlier on in this video. One other unit that can be particularly useful is catapults, and that's especially when you're defending against naval assaults, and given how slow Vengir can be, it can be useful to have a reliable unit like the catapult that can defend against attack by enemy ships. As always, I don't tend to recommend the use of mindbenders when playing against human enemies, because they tend to either avoid them entirely or simply be able to take them out with a ranged unit or a unit with the dash ability. Compared to that, you would be much better off using even a knight or a swordsman. Now of course there's a very real danger of running into an enemy who has a much stronger economy than you by the endgame. However, this is a risk you have to be prepared to take if you want to be playing one of the 2 weakest tribes in the game. There's simply no way around it. However, if you employ the strategies which I've mentioned already in this video, I think you should have a reasonable chance of success even playing as Vengir. That being said though, there is one last thing which bears mentioning, which is Vengir's relationship with the special tribes, and I've already talked about Illyrion, so I won't go into that here. But Polaris specifically is a tribe that can really do a lot of harm to Vengir in the late game because they have such a powerful late game military, but then Vengir has the advantage early on because Polaris don't tend to start off the game with an economic tech that they can really use, considering outposts are far too expensive to be using to level up your cities consistently early on anyhow. So typically when you're playing as Vengir and you see Polaris, I would prioritize attacking them early on, so you don't have to worry about getting units like giants and catapults who don't have the dash ability, chosen by enemy munis later on in the game. As for Aquarium, there's really not much to be said here. Aquarium are specifically a tribe that you tend to encounter some weaknesses against later on in the game. However, if you attack them early on, again they won't have a chance, and it can be worth mentioning that Aquarium, unlike numerous other tribes, can have difficulty getting started early on, so if you're capable of attacking them even into the middle game, turn 5, 6, 7, 8, you can potentially still do that because Aquarium won't necessarily have a stronger economy than you by that point. Because once again, they're not a turn 0 tribe and they don't really start off with a tech that's at all useful to their economy. It's more in the late game where tribes like Polaris and Aquarium, but Aquarium especially, come into their own. I think that's about all I have to say here regarding Vengir, so thank you for watching this video. I hope to see you in the next one, and I'm sorry I have a slight sore throat in this video, so I've been unable to do my usual commentary standard.